This is a plaster model of a bound foot. In the 19th century, it was used by Western missionaries who sought to bring an end to a practice that had endured in China for 1,000 years. Footbinding. Footbinding was, in many cases, an irreversible process that involved tightly wrapping and re-wrapping the foot in bandages over the best part of a decade with the goal of drastically reducing its size. At its height, the average woman who practiced it had a foot measuring around 5 inches. For reference, that's about the size of the foot of a toddler. Many attempts to explain footbinding get stuck on the spectacle, the shock, the nonsensical horror of it all. After all, we like being made to feel uncomfortable. It's entertaining. But that version of events is nowhere near as interesting as the story you're about to hear, because this isn't just a story about feet. It's a story about China. China is a sleeping giant, so the old saying goes. When she wakes, she will shake the world. Well, folks, how do I put this? The alarm clock's been going off for a while.
我在北京
What you export to the US. And China will lose the US market, which, as I've said, is 15%.
We don't care. We don't care. China has been here for 5,000 years. Most of the time, there was no United States, and we survived.
All right, so before we start talking about feet, and we will be doing a lot of that, let's take a minute and talk about China. Because it's easy from where we're standing today to mistake China's current rise for a beginning. But China is old. In fact, you'll sometimes hear the claim that China is the world's oldest continuous civilization. The CCP love this line, even though it's a huge oversimplification at best. China is vast and incredibly diverse, a patchwork of different languages and ethnicities. That being said, beyond all of China's divisions lie deeply shared continuities. Beliefs about ancestors and patriarchy, civility and conformity, the collective over the individual. Those continuities are real, and they come from China's deep past, as far back as records allow us to go, which in this case is 3,300 years at least. And consider this, China has one of the world's oldest writing systems, the oldest of the world's still widely used languages, and its dynasties, its ruling families and their vision of empire has endured for a remarkably long time. Broken, often contrived in bloodshed, but never truly abandoned, from the 3rd century BCE until the last emperor of the 20th century. The oldest continuous civilization, well, that's up for debate. But there's no denying that that is a lot of history. For the most part, China's story is arguably a familiar one. War and peace, big personalities, empires, you know the drill. But the jarring reality of practices like, say, footbinding have a funny way of exposing its differences, and in turn, our own blind spots. Right now, we are all looking at China's future, but to truly understand it, we need to first look at its past. And I think that the humble practice of footbinding will give us a window. But look, I'll admit, that's a pretty big claim, and for an hour-and-a-half-long documentary about feet, it's also kind of an intense place to start. So where do we begin? Well, how about here, at the beginning of China's most famous epic, with one of its most famous lines, which just so happens to capture one of China's most profoundly interesting concepts. It goes something like this. Everything that is united will fall apart, and everything that has fallen apart will come back together again. So it has always been. Chaos and unity, beginnings and endings, how different are they really? I'm not so sure. So, why don't we start at both? Meet Li Yu, the last ruler of a dying dynasty. Yeah, things had not been going well for Li Yu. You see, just over half a century ago, the great Tang dynasty, a golden age in China's history, had collapsed. And while Li Yu's state was founded on the claim of being its true successor, that wasn't quite how things had worked out. And now, he and his court found themselves one of several regional powers, struggling to preserve what precious little autonomy they still had, under the shadow of a new rising power in the north, the mighty Song dynasty. Now, as you might imagine, this situation left Li Yu with a fair few problems, but only one that mattered really. The new empire was tolerating him, but it sure would be a lot more convenient for a lot of people if he, well, didn't exist. From the 960s, the Song dynasty was collecting smaller kingdoms like infinity stones as it marched towards unification of the empire under a new emperor and bloodline. And frankly speaking, Li Yu's claim to the preceding dynasty was a messy loose end. It's not that he'd done anything wrong per se. In fact, he'd spent much of his life trying to appease people. But the poor guy only had to so much as breathe too loudly, and the new Song emperor would develop a sudden, mysterious migraine in his palace some 500 kilometers away. How is the empire supposed to rest, he'd famously say, when it's being disturbed by the snoring of someone else? Yeah, things were not looking good. Time was running out, and everybody at Li Yu's court knew it. And so, seeing the writing on the wall, Li Yu turned inwards, neglecting the few remaining duties assigned to him and earning himself a reputation as an indulgent and incompetent ruler, even amongst some of his own advisors. Li Yu's thinking is not particularly hard to understand in hindsight. Out there was complicated, perilous. But in here, inside the confines of his palace, he had all the wine, women, and poetry in the world to make his problems go away. In here, he could create heaven on earth. And so that's exactly what he did. Li Yu spent his days painting, banqueting, cancelling important meetings, sneaking around his own palace to meet his wife's younger sister, writing poetry with titles like Getting Up While Ill, Feelings While Ill, I Wrote This While I Was Ill. Oh, let's see, what else is there? Building a large golden rooster, a symbol of imperial authority in his palace, only to tell the Song emperor who got word of the statue and was furious about it that no, it's not a rooster, it's actually just a weird-looking bird. Is it some sort of crime to enjoy a statue of a weird-looking bird? No? Then, leave me alone. Anyway, perhaps the most interesting of all Li Yu's antics is the fact that he maintained a female-only entertainment training program on palace grounds. Situated in the wealthy heartland of southern China, his court upheld its ancestral reputation as a mecca of music and dance. But among the endless stream of mesmerising performances, I want to tell you about one in particular. You see, one night, the court gathered in front of the palace's grand stage, only to find a huge golden lotus standing 6 feet tall right at the centre of it. Commissioned by Li Yu himself and adorned with jewels, ribbons and plumes of cloud-like material, it was a marvel. And right at its centre was a platform on which his favourite dancer, Yaoniang, had been asked to perform. But that was not Li Yu's only request, because that night, he commanded that her feet be so tightly bound that they curved upwards into a point, like a new moon. With her feet bound, Yaoniang danced in front of all the court with an ethereal grace, as if she were a moon soaring above the clouds. Seeing how utterly mesmerised the dancer had made her audience, from then on, the women of the palace began to copy her style, bound feet and all. So, okay, Yaoniang probably wasn't a real person. But to be fair, the story itself was fashioned from surprisingly credible historical circumstances. After all, there's plenty of evidence that court entertainers like her, who everybody longed for but few could actually afford, were pretty much a fixture of palace life by Li Yu's time. While there are many legends surrounding the origins of footbinding, these days historians are mostly in agreement. Li Yu's world, and perhaps even the last decades of the preceding dynasty, are as close to the origin of footbinding as we can locate in knowable history. In fact, let me show you one of the few painted scrolls we have depicting this world, because I think it's extremely telling. It's called The Night Revels. Rendered in incredible detail, this scroll depicts the opulent courtly indulgence that defined Li Yu's court, in this case seen at a minister's estate. Now, there's a lot going on here, but if we look closely, a small detail slips through, right underneath the hemline. A tiny, upturned foot. Of course, troops of female entertainers had been kept by elite men for centuries for a variety of diversions, but it was Li Yu and his cosmopolitan predecessors who elevated the practice, catapulting palace entertainers into the celebrities of their day and indulging their desires in the process. And those desires, it turned out, were tiny crescent-shaped feet. But where, I hear you desperately screaming, did this preference come from in the first place? Well, funny thing, desire. Because if you really think about it, why do we desire anything? The answer is, as ever, rather complicated. But in Li Yu's case, it probably wasn't helped by the fact that by the 10th century, a fair few poets, the prestige influencers and art critics of their day, would not shut up about tiny feet. Now, this obsession had been building for over a millennia at this point. First, poets waxed lyrical about a woman's diminutive stature, then it was her airy, light-footed gait, Then it was an obsession with tiny shoes and slippers, and finally by the 9th century, the last years of the Tang dynasty for which Liu claimed to be a successor, it was the foot itself. Poems with names like Ode to Slippers, which detailed the story of a 5th century emperor and his favoured consort, Pan Fei, were keen to emphasise the ideal size, 6 inches. Legend has it that said consort was made to walk on golden lotus-shaped tiles while the emperor exclaimed in rapturous joy. While there's no evidence that Pan bound her feet, clearly the emperor in question was not immune to the foot propaganda of his time, and neither was the author of this embellished poem about the pair, which was written 400 years after the alleged golden tile incident using a contemporaneous note as its source, but which leaves out the bit where the emperor had to have anything vaguely cane-shaped removed from the court because of the frequency with which Pan threatened to, and dare I say probably did, whack him with them. But I digress. Poems like this were just the start, and by the late Tang dynasty, the message was unmistakable. Size matters. The smaller, the better. Yeah, I'm going to leave that one where it is. Now, I'm skipping over a ton of poetry here, but this ideal, as so many are, was instilled by repetition. Lots of repetition. And by the time Liu was coquettishly mincing around his palace in the 10th century, probably drinking wine straight out of the jug and pretending like the world wasn't falling apart, the desirability and decadence of small feet, and their associations with lotuses, had been established amongst the elites, such that taking one's socks off had become taboo. Liu and men like him were no longer content to imagine such feet. They wanted to make them real, to live as the poets imagined. Now, is it realistic to be demanding that people's feet take the shape of a crescent moon? No, not really. But reality is for poor people, and as we've established, Liu wanted no part in it. By the spring of the year 975, everything had begun to fall apart for Liu. The army of what would become China's new ruling dynasty was quite literally banging at the palace gate. In those final weeks, Liu had a screen erected in the audience hall so that he would not be disturbed with all the bad news coming in from the messengers. During the final siege, he withdrew into his palace to talk classics and chant sutras while defences faltered. The time for the empire to unite once more, albeit by force, had come. Liu would be the last ruler of his dynasty. Someone, after all, has to be. But he would go down as one of the greatest poets in all of Chinese history. The beginning of footbinding, the end of a dynasty. Times were once again about to change. So, as the old saying goes, it has always been. When a young woman by the name of Wen Wan approached a sprawling regional administrative compound to attend a local official's banquet, more than a century had passed since the halcyon days of Liu's court. But the entertainment culture he and his dynasty had inherited and refined, that was still alive and well. Because this evening, Wen had been hired as a courtesan, an entertainer, trained to bring poetry, music, conversation and companionship to elite gatherings. However, unlike Liu's court, these gatherings carried a different weight. The performances here weren't just entertainment, they were a fixture of bureaucratic life, part of doing business. And they were also, as this anecdote found in the private notebook of a Song Dynasty scholar tells us, rehearsals of a social order that reached far beyond the banquet hall. So the story goes, that night, a local official was desperate to impress a visiting dignitary who just so happened to be one of the most formidable Confucian scholars of his time, Sima Guang. That night, as the food was being served and the drinks were flowing, Sima Guang asked the official about a courtesan who he'd heard was adept at discussing the Confucian disciple known as Mencius. And the courtesan in question, of course, was Wen. You see, after being left indebted due to the untimely passing of her merchant father, her aunt and uncle, astonished by her intellect, raised Wen as a boy long enough to secure her an education, one she later continued in private as a woman. Though the same debts later drove her into courtesanship, her ability to debate the Confucian classics was such a novelty that occasionally her skills were trotted out as a party trick to middling officials who'd had one too many. But Sima Guang, who was now staring at her, presumably with a rather bemused look on his face, was not a middling official. And so, according to the anecdote, Wen said the following: Mencius was near to the sages. How could someone like me presume to discuss his book? Now, that should have been enough to shut him up. I mean, no one had ever been under the impression that 𝗀𝗏 actually wanted to debate a woman. But that night, for whatever reason, he did. And so he responded, "Oh, I'm sure you could. In fact, I insist." This was not good. The entire banquet hall was now watching. One wrong move, and Wen's career was over. And so she chose her next words very carefully. "I am but a woman," she told 𝗀𝗏. To speak of Mencius before a great scholar would be like trying to lift Mount Tai and leap over the North Sea. To act beyond one's strength and station, you understand. Masterful. And indeed he did. Because Wen had just cited an obscure line from the Book of Mencius, which highlights the philosophical difference between can't and won't. A very risky strategy. But it paid off, and 𝗀𝗏 announced to the room, "You gentlemen should appreciate such modesty and capability in a mere woman." The banquet was, needless to say, a rousing success, and Wen earned herself an arguably bittersweet promotion. Now, this encounter is remarkable, because it gives us a vital glimpse into a world in which footbinding was about to flourish. The problem is that this world is not going to fully make sense unless we take the time to unpack it. And to do that, I'm sorry to say, we are all going to need to sit down and enjoy a succulent Chinese metaphysical detour. Right, so pretty much from the get-go, Chinese philosophers were really big on this idea of balance, harmony, and cycles. Ever heard of yin and yang? It's the idea that everything in the universe contains two linked opposites, day and night, life and death, rise and fall, that depend, define, and rely on each other. Can't have night without day, can't have life without death. That idea comes from China. Now, in the beginning, this balance simply described a natural harmony. Night is not better than day, it just is. But it did beg the question, if this is how order works in nature, then why not society as well? Over time, a very long time, these ideas were absorbed into and alongside the development of a social and moral framework, most notably by what has been described as the most influential school of thought in all of China, and many would argue East Asia. I'm talking, of course, about Confucianism. Now, stay with me here. Confucianism's founder, Confucius, who was born in the 6th century BCE, had big ideas about the path to harmony and order. Put simply, too simply really, but it'll have to do, a well-ordered society begins with individuals taking moral responsibility for how they live and treat others. A healthy sense of shame, which carries far more weight than the threat of punishment alone, is the glue that holds it all together. Now, Confucius actually saw himself as a transmitter of much older traditions that he felt had been lost, the good old days. In his world, individualism simply won't do. Like night and day, everyone has their roles. But in this case, it's within a set of clearly defined reciprocal social relationships, and failure to fulfill them risked opening the door to chaos and disorder. Father, son, minister, or ruler, Confucianism posits that inside a man, there are two wolves. Junzi, a man of virtue, and Xiaoren, a petty man. If moral cultivation was your goal, and it ought to be, you definitely wanted to be the former. But okay, so what did Confucius have to say about petty and virtuous women? Well, it's basically one line. It is not pleasing to have to do with women and petty men. If you show them too much affection, they become too excited. And if you keep them at a distance, they are full of resentment. Okay. While Confucius may not have had much to say about women specifically, his followers, who would later expand upon his thinking many centuries after his death, absolutely did. By the 2nd century BCE, man and woman, one of several key reciprocal relationships in Confucianism, got the yin and yang treatment. Men, it was thought, were yang, outer, bright, open, warm, strong, and active, and women were yin, inner, dark, hidden, cold, weak, and passive. Soon enough, these ideas were consolidated into idealized codes of behavior, as outlined in the seminal 1st century text known as Lessons for Women. Now, there are a lot of different rules in here about the speech, appearance, and work of a good Confucian woman, but in the chapter titled Respect and Caution, it's written, quote, "As yin and yang are not of the same nature, so man and woman differ in behavior. The virtue of yang is firmness, yin is manifested in yielding. Man is honoured for strength, a woman is beautiful on account of her gentleness." Hence, the book tells us, there arose the common saying, "A man born as a wolf may, it is feared, become a weak monstrosity, but a woman born as a mouse may, it is feared, become a tigress." Okay, so as archaic as this sounds, it's worth pointing out that most women took these assigned roles quite seriously, as one tends to when told from the time at which they form their first thoughts that their role holds up not just the social contract, but the very cosmological order of things. It's really no big shock, therefore, that Lessons for Women was written by a woman, one who puts the matter rather plainly. If a wife does not serve her husband, then the natural order is neglected and destroyed. Okay, great. So here we are then, some 1700 years after Confucius' death, 600 years or so after Lessons for Women, and a century or so after Li Yu. Detours over, welcome back to the Song dynasty. By the late 11th century, around the same time Wen and Sima were glaring at each other across the banquet table, the Song economy, which was one of the most prosperous economies of its time, was booming. That meant more time for reading and thinking, which meant more time for men to take the official governmental exams required to enter what had long been considered the most prestigious occupation of them all, a government official. But here's where things get interesting, because Wen wasn't entertaining royals, she was entertaining a newly expanded and highly educated group of exam-passing scholar officials, often referred to in the literature by their far sexier name, the literati. By the Song dynasty, such banquets had become a fixture of literati social life, and so too had Confucian social norms around men and women's respective roles, which, like night and day, were defined in opposition to one another. In fact, using much older texts as their inspiration, many scholars had actually taken things a step further, most notably our pal, the widely revered Sima Guang, who penned the following line: "A girl 10 or older does not go out. She remains permanently inside. Men handle outside affairs, women inside affairs." While many of the educated literati elite were on board with these ideas when it came to their families, they took a suspiciously flexible approach when it came to the banquets and entertainment quarters. So long as courtesans behaved as inner and subordinate, that would suffice. No need to be so literal about matters. While there was the occasional diatribe from some old scholar along the lines of, "This feels like a contradiction, we should probably stop," it was usually met with something along the lines of, "True, but consider this." I don't want to, really. By the Song dynasty, women, long constructed as naturally complementary, supportive and subordinate, became the ultimate status symbol. Simply put, a successful man was one surrounded by attractive and attentive women, a natural expression of a man's rightful place within the cosmic order. In theory, like night and day, not better or worse, higher or lower, but just different. In practice, well, it's maybe a bit more complicated. Needless to say, the market for courtesans like Wen, who could be purchased by wealthy families and government offices who were now running official training centres for them, exploded during the Song. Official training centres, you say? Yes, and if that idea is ringing a few bells for you, good memory. Because government-sanctioned courtesans like Wen were not reinventing entertainment culture and aesthetic desire anew. They were following patterns already set up in the palaces of people like Li Yu and his predecessors. When those old dynasties exploded, they scattered their pieces across the empire, beautiful palace entertainers included. And no prizes for guessing what kind of beauty standards they brought with them when that happened. By the late 11th century, records show literati poetry rhapsodizing about tiny bound feet. New moons forever, they called them, so wondrously small that they defy description, and leave no physical trace. Tiny feet had become both increasingly desirable and, more importantly, increasingly accessible, as had another important temptation in the marketplace of women: concubines. Secondary wives or partners, not as high-ranking as the first wife, but still perfectly capable of bearing the son that was necessary to inherit the family line. Now, one option was to just straight up buy a concubine from a commoner family. Or, hear me out, why not this here courtesan? After all, she already seems pretty interested, totally of her own free will. Okay, so here's where a few of the conceptual puzzle pieces start to come together. Simply put, the world in which footbinding began to flourish was a complicated and connected one. Throughout the Song dynasty, jealousy, insecurity, and competition were increasingly basic realities in the lives of many elite women. That competition existed between wives and the courtesans their husbands became enamored with, as well as the concubines that were brought into the family home to live right alongside them. But showing any such displays of jealousy, as Sima himself opined, was petty and risked disrupting harmony. Now, to be clear, it's far too simple to blame Confucianism for footbinding. But my point here is there's no denying that it helped create a world in which the practice could thrive. For elite women, it was a world based on competition. But how does a woman compete for favour in a world where, as we saw at the banquet, she cannot even dare publicly discuss the very principles that governed her place in it? One part of the answer to that question is footbinding. It was an invisible weapon to be wielded in multiple arenas, enough to attract the attention of a desirable young scholar, and perhaps even enough to keep his eyes away from the courtesans and concubines, but not too ostentatious, too outer, too public, and importantly, something that involved absolutely no competition with men. In Wen's world, the 11th century, footbinding had not yet reached the height of its popularity, even among elites. But by the 12th century, casual references to footbinding within those circles became more common. By the 13th century, archaeological evidence shows clearly that footbinding, mostly similar to the style found in Li Yu's court, was quite common among the daughters and wives of officials in certain areas. We know this because beginning in the 1970s, a number of excavations revealed the tombs of some of these wives, who were buried alongside their binders and their tiny upturned socks and shoes, and in many cases, right alongside their husband and his concubines. I don't think we'll ever understand the full complexity behind their decision-making. But in their world, a world that placed the highest moral value on domesticity and motherhood, where a wife's standing within her family of marriage depended on the birth of male heirs, that, unlike the literati, their path to respect was not through the mind, but through the body, via birth or beauty, ideally both. So how does this part of our story end? Well, unable to bear him a child, Summer's wife, a paragon of Confucian virtue, found him a concubine herself, who he chastised and ignored until, as his recorded heir attests to, he did not. As for Wen, she eventually made it out of courtesanship and went on to live a life of seclusion, where she penned several essays and poems. Isn't it funny? She mused in one of her more famous verses on how being given to emotion is by its very nature to invite pain. Wen may not have bound her feet, but make no mistake, in her world, the architecture of confinement was already finished. In 1967, in what was a middling market town just outside of Shanghai, some local farmers happened upon a series of 13 scrolls known to us now as the 𝘁𝗵𝗿𝗀. And by happened upon, I mean they fell out of a flooded tomb after the entrance had been kicked in by a local militia, before eventually reaching a museum via an antique shop where they were recognised as one of the most important Chinese literary discoveries of the 20th century. But there we are. The scrolls were found in the tomb of Madame Xuan, the wife of a relatively low-ranking official and matriarch of an up-and-coming merchant family. By the time of her burial at the turn of the 16th century, nearly 400 years had passed since the Song dynasty banquet we were just at. Welcome to the Ming dynasty. The Mongol conquest of China has been and gone, but the practice of footbinding, that's been gaining ground almost exclusively amongst the elite classes for a few centuries. However, thanks in part to scrolls like the 𝘁𝗵𝗿𝗀, times were once again about to change. Now, Madame Xuan's copy was printed in Beijing in the 1470s, but they'd probably been circulated and distributed by travelling merchants a bit earlier than that. Either way, the scrolls were dismissed by scholars at the time as too vulgar and lowbrow to be worthy of preservation. Written by men, but largely aimed at women, the 𝘁𝗵𝗿𝗀s were richly illustrated, mixing text and song in simple prose with large, easy-to-read characters, and that's because they were partly designed to be read and sung amongst a group, young and old alike. The stories themselves are, well, they're of their time, and that time was many, many centuries ago where family sing-alongs and true crime was a perfectly acceptable combination. But what we're really interested in here are the ideas that these highly popular and much-loved stories are transmitting. And nowhere are they communicated more plainly than in the scroll titled, The Case of Imperial Uncle Cao. The story starts with a hopeful scholar named Yuan. Newly accepted to sit the imperial exams, he sets off with his beautiful wife Zhang and their young son for the capital. The city with its bustling streets and glittering lights is described in dazzling detail, and the family are blown away by its grandeur. But one night, while exploring it, the family encounters Cao, the empress's younger brother, and disaster strikes. Enraptured by the beautiful Zhang, he abducts her and takes her back to his manor. That night, Zhang is summoned to join Cao for a drink, but fearing he may kill her to conceal his crime, she becomes determined to gain the upper hand. It's here that the song portion, or the chant, begins. It's a vivid account of Zhang's transformation into a vision of irresistible beauty. She applies rouge, she styles her hair with ornate accessories, puts on a musk-scented silk jacket, and then she glides out of the room, lightly moving on lotus steps, like an immortal fairy, curved shoes on her feet, measuring, are you ready for this? 3 inches long. Zhang dramatically enters the banquet hall, flanked by rows of maids and plumes of incense, and Cao, who's literally in tears at her beauty, finds himself unable to do away with her, and so he orders a servant to do it. But that leeway gives Zhang time to escape and return to the capital safely, where she helps set a clever legal trap, and Cao finally gets his comeuppance. Romance, revenge, lust, murder? Lessons for women the 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝗹 were not. And you better believe the literati were not happy about it. By the 15th century, while many were okay with female literacy for the purposes of studying the Confucian classics and maybe teaching their sons to read, many drew the line at the kinds of stories found in the 𝘁𝗵𝗶ables. And throughout the Ming, the debate about whether female literacy ultimately encouraged vanity, self-assertion, and a loss of femininity was raging. As one official put it, booksellers of the current age, greedy for profit, choose to fabricate fictional and miscellaneous tales. Peasants, artisans, merchants, and peddlers like to copy and illustrate these works. Every household keeps a collection, so they are available to everyone. Foolish, ignorant women are particularly addicted to them. The problem with female literacy was that by the 15th century, the horse had already bolted. Kind of. Mothers were teaching daughters, and a surge of easy-to-read scrolls had created a new tier of semi-literate, affluent women. Not enough literacy to pen a novel, perhaps, but enough to do the unthinkable. Use the written word for pleasure, empathy, or escape. It was, after all, an activity that growing numbers of wealthy women had the time to pursue, because that whole woman inside, man outside thing, that situation hadn't improved. Even China's small but steady trickle of foreign missionaries had noticed it. These cities are great, they'd say. Amazing, really. I mean, bloody hell, you got a whole other world out here, but where are all the women? The short answer was inside, though the crones and the poorly bred, as the missionaries called them, remain visible. But everyone knows they don't count, so. The thing that's really interesting about all of this is that those same missionaries also happened to note another prominent feature of womanhood in these newly explored lands: the practice of footbinding. You see, the problem with books and scrolls is that they spread ideas, notions, and soon enough, thanks to the increase in commercial publishing houses in 15th century Beijing, and then a subsequent explosion of printing, the glamour and prestige of footbinding continued to spread outwards amongst the super elite, but also downwards to the wives of lower-ranking officials, landholders, and merchants. Stories like those found in the 𝘁𝗵𝗶ables, much loved, memorised and performed in the inner quarters of multi-generational households as entertainment to young girls, grandmothers, concubines and first wives alike, drummed the standard into anyone who heard them or sang them aloud. And look, when it comes to propagating desire, it's amazing how well simple repetition works. How many times and in how many ways can one stand to be told something is ethereally, gut-wrenchingly, visceratingly beautiful before one starts to secretly, or overtly, desire it? I don't know, maybe we should ask this guy. While the exact nature of the practice was vague in Li Yu's time, nobody's really sure if footbinding was full-blown body modification or not, by the Ming it was unmistakable. Footbinding was a permanent alteration, and it probably had been for a few centuries. One of the most convincing pieces of evidence we have for this are household manuals, lifestyle guides. Think Good Housekeeping meets Pinterest and Instagram. Now, these household manuals had included footbinding instructions in one form or another since the 13th century, though the audience was almost exclusively the super elite. But here in the 15th century, those same encyclopedias are now legible and affordable to growing numbers of women, right alongside stories like those found in the 𝘁𝗵𝗶ables. Even though binding styles had always varied by region, by this point, the goal mostly seemed to involve binding the foot into a sharper, sometimes upturned point by tucking the toes underneath the foot, and for now at least, the arch was left thoroughly alone. That being said, when it came to technique, every manual claimed to have the best. One promised a 𝗀𝗵𝗃 palace method for shrinking the lotus step that even a 30-year-old woman can use. Another advertised its own special soak known as 𝗀𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁𝗁 which, the book assured readers, would make the foot as soft as cotton wool, putting up no resistance to swaddling. These guides, which advised soaking and powdering the feet over several days and then tightly wrapping them up in a long strip of fabric, and then redoing them every other day for the best part of a decade until death do they part, sat under boudoir matters, right alongside cures for pimples and hair loss. Of course, the idea that soaking the foot could make bones more malleable is pure fantasy. But that's precisely the point. With names like the Palace Method, these recipes are deliberately evoking images of court life, the imagined birthplace of footbinding, as a marketing device. Yet the fact that these guides also advised on how to minimize injury and infection tells us something crucial. Even though nobody was quite going for Zhang's legendary 3 inches, yet, footbinding was still a risky business. Because no matter how these guides framed it, the truth of the matter remained. Achieving this new palace style was really quite difficult, particularly if the feet were already grown. The solution had seemed obvious from as far back as the late Song, perhaps even a bit earlier. It would be a lot easier to just start the binding at a younger age, before the feet had a chance to grow. Now, context here. This was especially important because for much of China's history, marriage for most girls was a family decision tied to reputation and wealth. And as much as the literati was still trying to deny it in person, by the Ming, footbinding had become increasingly desirable on the list of wants for a wife in the marriage market among the affluent. A desirable body, which was intrinsically linked with virtue, meant a higher bride price, and perhaps more options when it came to choosing a husband. In a world with little legal protection for women and very steep consequences for slipping in status, you'll recall Wen's banquet story, you really wanted options. I cannot overstate this. A good marriage could mean the difference between a relatively comfortable life and an utterly miserable one. And no one knew this more intimately than a girl's mother. And so from around the late Song and ramping up in the Ming, the age at which binding took place in wealthy households gradually decreased to around 5 or 6 years old. Soon enough, the practice became ritualized and was often overseen by elder women in the family. Many scholar officials condemned the practice on children, and the complaints only grew more vocal during the Ming. They just couldn't understand why it was done at such a young age. The fact is, it was almost impossible to get the feet to a desirable size and shape without starting this early. Had some of those scholar officials cared to look, they might have found part of the answer inside one of 13 dusty old scrolls. Scrolls that Madame Zhuan, and perhaps many others, had loved so dearly that they had chosen to be buried with them, right alongside their binding bandages. You see, the stories inside were far more powerful than any of the admonitions from educated men. After all, they only reaffirmed what women and little girls already knew in their hearts. Footbinding made women more beautiful. Beauty indicated virtue, virtue raised value, and value in the marketplace for female bodies meant power. The chance to secure a better husband, better social standing, and even perhaps a measure of protection. It's therefore particularly heartbreaking, but not surprising in the least, that the evidence suggests that many young girls thought the bound foot was really quite beautiful, and that some even agreed to it because they wanted to be beautiful, and that, in some cases, took to doing it themselves as teens so as not to be left out. The fact that these girls were simply not able to consent to footbinding notwithstanding, most young girls had their feet bound whether they liked it or not. In a world built on this kind of storytelling, simple ideas about free will become insufficient. To be clear, most mothers loved and doted on their daughters, and fathers too, and the choice was not always as easy nor as clear-cut as we often imagine it to be. There are more than a few stories of parents anxiously putting it off, of mothers and grandmothers crying alongside their daughters while doing it. But the truth is, forces larger than human emotions had created a deficit. Footbinding had become a way to add value to a daughter that was in want of it by default, and love alone was not enough to fill the void. For many daughters, and mothers too, desire was trained before they even had a choice in the matter. And no doubt, having listened to stories like the 𝘁𝗵𝗹𝗋, many went to bed dreaming only of how lovely it would be to glide through a room on lotus feet, to have every gaze follow their step, to be, if only in a dream, an unkillable, ethereal beauty with a golden crown and tiny feet, just like Zhang. Let's recap what we know so far. The desire for small feet was established many moons ago by the poets. Wealthy men sought to bring those desires to life, and then via storytelling and deeply embedded cultural expectations about womanhood, throughout the Song and into the Ming, the practice of footbinding, a permanent alteration of the bones and ligaments of the foot, with the goal of achieving one of many styles, so long as that style was smaller, spread from the super elite, slowly trickling down to just the affluent, all of whom had begun to carry out the practice on their young daughters. Things were already bad. But you saw the diagram right at the start, so you know things are about to get much worse. Because with enough will and force, feet can not only be made to be narrower, they can also be made to be shorter. Just a few decades after the 𝘁𝗵𝗶𝗶𝗋 were printed, something terrible was beginning to rear its head. The Ming dynasty, it turned out, saw unprecedented economic and cultural expansion. In fact, by the 16th century, its economy had become the largest in the world, and with it came commercialization and new wealth, a bloated literati class, and extremely heightened levels of status anxiety, which included an incredibly intensified social emphasis on appearance. Marriage prospects were, more than ever, a fundamental part of this. This accelerated drive to make sure families secured beneficial marriages came alongside a hardening of Confucian values, and all of this in turn coalesced into what can only be described as ferocious competition for the smallest feet, not just amongst the elite, but increasingly among affluent non-elites, whose wealth and influence was growing by the day. So, okay, I'm going to be honest with you. We have no idea who the first woman to take things a step further by folding her foot in on itself actually was. But we do know what it was called. The Golden Lotus. In its most perfect form, it rendered the foot some 3 inches in length, though very few women could actually achieve this and most got to about 5 inches. Of course, that fact didn't stop them from trying. This new Golden Lotus style necessitated a much more aggressive form of binding that pushed the metatarsal bones upward, drastically reducing the distance between the back of the heel and the tip of the toe, and creating a cleft in the arch in the process. This was mostly achieved by simply making the bindings tighter, but sometimes women would resort to more extreme methods, which of course only heightened the risk of permanent injury, or in extreme cases, a life-threatening infection which could very well, and sometimes did, result in death. The goal was never to break the bones in the initial binding process. That's actually a common misconception, but this new type of binding made it a very real possibility once one started walking, which of course was made increasingly precarious, though notably, in most cases, not impossible. Again, another common misunderstanding. Of course, the problem was that the mass of the foot didn't just disappear entirely, and so many ended up with a lumpy bulge on the top of the foot, which many took to hiding with well-placed hemlines and specially designed shoes, which, believe it or not, was considered cheating by some. Beyond the sheer volume of tiny Ming Dynasty shoes preserved in museums today, 2 of the clearest indications that the appetite for more extreme forms of foot binding was growing in the 16th century were the rising attention paid to the practice within medical circles and a sudden surge of curious scholarly interest among the literati. All of a sudden, foot binding was everywhere, even amongst the wives of lower-ranking officials. A small but not insignificant cohort of the literati became obsessed with locating the practice's origins, and this quest resulted in some of the finest and pettiest trolling I have ever had the pleasure of reading. You see, the literati started looking to poetry and historical anecdotes to come up with all sorts of explanations as to the origins of the practice, including scholar Yang Shen, who at some point in the first half of the 16th century basically said, "You're all idiots, you haven't looked far back enough. I have, and I found this note from a magistrate dating back to the 3rd century about a maiden whose feet were, quote, packed together." Commenting on this finding, Yang then attached his own commentary to this magistrate's note, writing, and I'm quoting him directly here, "Upon reading these words, it dawned on me that foot binding has existed since the later Han period. Once those words escaped my mouth, even a fast chariot drawn by 4 horses could not call them back." And then he signed his name alongside the alleged primary source. To be clear, Yang Shen was claiming that the origins of foot binding lay some 700 years earlier than any other scholar of his time or as has ever proposed. Of course, when modern historians came to look at this magical magistrate's note, they realised that Yang, an exiled scholar with a lot of time on his hands, had done the historical equivalent of replying to his burner account. In other words, he just made the note up. This little trick managed to rage bait his fellow scholars with astounding success for well over a century, with one scholar by the name of Hu Yinglin even going so far as to dedicate 3 entire books to correcting Yang's omissions. 3 books. Had he been around to see said books, Yang, who it turned out was actually a hardened criminal in the academic forgery game and was almost certainly trying to make a wider epistemological point about his peers' insistence on the knowability of the past via fanciful historical texts, would have no doubt been kicking his feet and giggling. You really think someone would do that, Hu Yinglin? Just go into the historical records and tell lies? I don't think so. Why don't you try and write a few more chapters? All right, so Yang Shen is actually making an extremely prescient point here. Because when it comes to trying to figure out how educated men felt about the bound foot at around this time, things very quickly start to become absurd. For example, when not obsessing about Yang Shen, Hu Yinglin wrote in the late 16th century that even though the bound foot was actually quite foul once the socks were off, the footwear does look, well, kind of cool. And then in the 17th century, one of the best-selling authors of his time, Li Yu, not to be confused with the other foot-loving Li Yu, initially proclaimed the bound foot to be obviously icky and gross, only to then later apparently confess that a trip up north had changed his mind and that their ostensible bonelessness was in fact quite acceptable to him. And then when pushed on this and many of the other outlandish claims he made, he said, yeah, you know what, broadly speaking, everything I have ever written was intended to make people laugh. So the point I'm trying to make here, and this is sine qua non of any inquiry that relies on human testimony and is very much going to come up again before this video is through, is this. Sometimes people are out here talking bollocks. Okay? Absolute bollocks. And Ming Dynasty scholars, being people, are no exception to that rule. People are complicated. Sometimes they make things up. Sometimes they don't know how they feel. And sometimes they know damn well how they feel, but they just don't want to admit it. Here's the thing. When it comes to the literati, for people who often go so out of their way to condemn the practice, to construct it as frivolous, they do seem to have left us with a rather impressive amount of poetry about tiny little feet. And even if they hadn't, the fact remained. As one dynasty bled into the next, increasing numbers of men were not willing to accept a wife without it. By the time that Li Yu was yapping about the joys of his boneless banquet, dynasties had once again changed. In 1644, the Ming dynasty had turned into the Qing dynasty, and things had gotten messy. The masters of China's last ever dynasty, an ethnic minority called the Manchu, had won their place amid a messy and devastating cascade of rebellions, famines, environmental catastrophes, fiscal crises, civil wars, a small ice age, the deadliest earthquake in recorded history, a major man-made flooding event that levelled an entire city, locust swarms, the plague, and the beginning of a decades-long conflict with the Dutch, which saw what was at the time the largest naval encounter between Chinese and European forces that the world had ever witnessed. Finally, in November of 1644, a 6-year-old Manchu prince was enthroned as the first Qing ruler, leaving the remaining population with the age-old, deep-seated fear that has been expressed by peasants, wealthy merchants and zookeepers alike. I am never going to financially recover from this. But as we already know, what goes down must also come back up, and China would indeed financially recover from this. The 17th century was a little dicey, but by the 18th, China was back on form, both wealthy and relatively politically stable. And in the meantime, status anxiety grew unabated. Compared to its slow and steady spread amongst the elite and upper classes, throughout the 17th century and significantly ramping up in the 18th, footbinding as a practice spread down the social classes like wildfire, until it reached, quote-unquote, the peasants' daughters. The question is, how? Because don't peasants need to work? Well, yeah, but footbinding, remember, didn't actually preclude you from walking or working. It just made it a bit more precarious, in which case you just bound your feet in a slightly less extreme manner, got a job that involved sitting, or just lived with the pain. The idea that footbinding existed to keep women housebound or signalled that a family didn't need to work is a bit of a misunderstanding. It's partly coincidental. Elite women adopted the practice early and were less likely to do heavy labour, but it's also shaped by what we choose to count as work. Domestic labour, textile production, childcare, they've rarely qualified. But agricultural labour almost certainly does, and we have plenty of outdoor lotus boots, caked in mud from fieldwork, and literal photographs of women walking and working with bound feet. On the contrary, it was precisely because footbinding didn't preclude the economic contribution of peasant daughters that it was able to spread so rapidly amongst them throughout the Qing dynasty. But just as the actual manner in which the foot was bound had changed over time and place, so too now had the reasons. By this point, footbinding's utility as a viable economic strategy that allowed one to marry up was still a factor, but its effectiveness was already beginning to erode. After all, the more women that adopted it, the less of an advantage it bestowed. Instead, by the 18th century, footbinding became a baseline expectation for any woman from China's ethnic majority, the Han, who wished to be considered respectable and civil, and peasant daughters who now found themselves in an increasingly connected and socially mobile world very much longed for the civility, glamour and status which they felt the practice conferred. Now, to be clear, it was not an expectation that every woman could, or in some cases wanted, to meet. While at its height in the Qing, almost 100% of elite women were expected to, and likely did, bind. For everyone else, if I'm reading the analysis of the data that does exist correctly, it was about 50%. Remember, China is incredibly diverse. Some areas and groups rejected it entirely, and in some, the adoption rate was up to 90%. Either way, at some point footbinding had mutated from a sign of elegance into a norm, and in many areas, failure or refusal to bind made women and girls targets. Shame had been part of footbinding since almost its inception, but status anxiety had pushed it to new extremes. Particularly within China's Han majority, this culture of shame was almost impossible to escape. Popular plays for mass audiences glorified the Golden Lotus ideal and made sport of those who failed to meet the standard. Women with large or poorly bound feet became stock figures of ridicule. Characters based on familiar tropes of aging spinsters and awkward country bumpkin maids were given humiliating roles on stage by being made to comically trip over their own monstrously large feet, or by being called cruel names like Madam Crooked Bones. Male actors would mock natural-footed women on stage by mimicking their so-called clumsy gait, usually alongside comic honking sounds. Pathetic attempts from older women at binding their feet, bandages flying off as they walked, were also a common comedic trope. Having large feet was shameful enough, but poorly bound feet, a representation of failed social ambition, was outright humiliating. This attitude was also mirrored on the streets. It wasn't uncommon for a natural-footed woman or young girl living in a village where footbinding was practiced to be called slave girl, Bigfoot, manly, or a barbarian by their peers, or even a random passerby. As one villager remembered it in one of the very few ethnographic studies conducted in the 19th century, an unbound girl's life might very well become, quote, intolerable, and she would be laughed at and despised and treated as a slave girl. She would not be allowed to do up her hair in the beautiful fashion that is permitted to the women with bound feet, nor wear the beautiful dresses. She would have to submit to the rules laid down by society for the conduct of a slave woman. Any attempt to evade these would arouse the anger of people on the street. For women who had been told that their beauty and gentility were the only things that afforded them value, the label of ugly and uncouth must have stung, because it meant you were worthless, and not just to men, but to society as a whole. It is perhaps somewhat predictable then, and altogether very appropriate, that the very thing that allowed footbinding to rise, shame, would also be the only thing that could send it crashing back down. It's just that no one expected quite how hard that fall would be. The 18th century was going well for China, until it turned into the 19th century. And then, suddenly, it was not. You know the drill. Times were, once again, about to change.
Of enormous importance for the future. For it is the empire, which includes 1/4 of all the land and of all the peoples of the world, that gives to Britain its position as a first-class power.
I have long said that letting the British out of their enclosure is somehow always a bad idea, and the British Empire's legacy in China is certainly no exception to that rule. Of course, there's evidence of contact between China and the West from Roman times, and China was certainly no stranger to foreign missionaries beforehand, but the 19th century marked an important turning point. By this point, the British Empire had become a global trading and military power that had discovered a new hobby called colonial expansionism, the domination of other people and their land for their own benefit, and they were really quite enthusiastic about it. So when the British encountered a civilization that was stubbornly uninterested in being managed, it posed a problem. You see, the British desperately wanted stuff from China, like tea, silk and porcelain, and China was mostly happy to oblige under strict trading conditions. Suddenly, silver was hemorrhaging out of the British Empire and into China, and the British didn't like that. So in 1793, they sent over a representative dressed in a pink velvet suit and matching feather hat with a 95-man entourage and a selection of the empire's finest wares, to have a little chat with the emperor. The conversation went something like this. Your Imperial Majesty, after a voyage of a year and a procession stretching farther than the eye can see, I humbly present to you the marvels of our empire. Clocks that sing, instruments that chart the heavens, glass finer than ice, a hot air balloon. Don't know who bought that. We have crossed the oceans to lay the wonder of our empire at your feet and to ask, with the greatest respect, that your ports be open to trade. What say you? No. What? I said, no. Why not? I don't want to. And then the Qing Emperor followed it up with a letter to the King of Great Britain, outlining that while he was impelled by their lonely remote islands' humble desire to partake of the benefits of our civilization, that our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and has no use for your country's manufactures. Oh, and by the way, should your vessels touch the shore, your merchants will be subject to instant expulsion. Do not say that you were not warned. And then the letter was finished with one of the genuinely funniest sign-offs I've ever read. Tremblingly obey. But not before calling the British barbarians some 16 times, which actually turned out to be a bit of a mistranslation, but it was funny all the same. Jokes aside, centuries of Chinese dominance and superiority had completely warped the Qing Empire's, or the Celestial Court's, sense of reality. By the late 18th century, the British Empire was still short of its imperial peak, but the direction of its growth was unmistakable. Sure enough, in order to balance the books, Britain, holding a monopoly on Indian opium, which is a whole other story, began selling it into China to reverse the trade deficit. China ordered it to stop, but it was smuggled in anyway, and by the 1830s, China was facing the sharp end of the world's most valuable single commodity trade. Opium addiction had hit a crisis point, and silver no longer flowed into China, it flowed out. In early 1839, China sent yet another strongly worded letter, this time to a 19-year-old Queen Victoria, proclaiming that China possessed an unfathomable, godlike majesty, that Britain's exports are simply cheap trinkets to the Chinese, and that in fact they all just sit around laughing at them. That England, on the other hand, would basically die without access to Chinese tea and rhubarb, before demanding that she command her people to stop poisoning China and to display obedience, so that both parties could continue to enjoy, quote, the blessings of peace. P.S., quote, please let your reply be speedy. Do not on any account make excuses or procrastinate. Oh, and P.P.S., just so you know, any foreigners bringing opium with design to sell shall most assuredly be decapitated. The Celestial Court was left unread, possibly because the letter was never even delivered. And so that summer, China seized over 1 million kilograms of opium and started lobbing it into the sea. Needless to say, the British were not happy, but with their forces being stationed so far away, China had been convinced that they would succumb to a lack of provisions before ever getting a chance to make a real show of power. Yeah, India's a really long way. There's no way they're going to be that callous, and dare I say, arrogant enough to... Long story short, yes they were. And soon enough, British naval forces, the most powerful in the world at the time, pulled up to one of China's major trading routes, polishing its cannons, laughing at its outdated defences, and, given the ridiculous levels of pretextual rhetoric around national pride at the time, probably blasting God Save the Queen on a JBL speaker. Britain had joined the war on drugs on the side of drugs, and China had seriously miscalculated. Over the next few decades, the British launched a series of assaults which ended with the British and French entering Beijing, capturing, destroying, and looting its palace. It was one of the finest achievements of Chinese imperial palace architecture, and it was burned to the ground. And now many of its plundered treasures are lying in the dusty old storerooms of the British Museum, where they are listed as acquired/found. Through brute force, China was made to agree to a series of humiliating treaties by Britain and a number of other Western powers, resulting in what is referred to today as its century of humiliation. And China's leadership still refers to this today, by the way. Territories were seized, egregious fines were issued, large sectors of its economy were appropriated, and its sovereignty was severely diminished. For 100 years, a Chinese court couldn't even try a foreigner for breaking its own laws. Not that I think any of us need reminding, but, just in case, by modern standards, and this might surprise you, but even a few historical ones, the British role in the Opium Wars is widely regarded as absolutely deplorable. This greed inevitably opened the door to long-standing political, economic, and social chaos. Throughout the 19th century, addiction was rife, and nearly all of China was affected by rebellions, most notably one led by a man who claimed not to be the reincarnation of Christ, but his brother. It was one of the deadliest civil wars in all of history. Foreigners had won, by force, the right to live and trade inside China's major port cities, known as treaty ports, which is where the majority of foreigners worked and lived, though it wasn't long before the whole of China was opened up. With this new influx of foreigners came a glut of memoirs, travel accounts, and perhaps most importantly, photographs, all of which made their way back to Europe and North America. Footbinding, offering a stark point of cultural contrast, quickly became a leading curiosity, and in some cases, an outright obsession. Exhibitions were held in London advertising a chance to see, and I'm reading from the pamphlet here, 2 female natives of the Celestial Empire and their very diminutive feet, which were, so the pamphlet claims, little more than 3 inches in length. This obsession had become so profound that at one point a British naval doctor obtained a, quote, specimen of said feet by outright stealing them from a coffin before preserving them to take home as a little memento. And I actually think I managed to locate said specimen in the Bart's Pathology Museum in London. I say think because they actually don't know where the jar of dismembered bound feet they own came from, just that they were donated between 1851 and 1862, which, since those dates line up with said naval doctor's travel patterns, probably means he handed them over when he got home and got bored of looking at them. But anyway, in the latter part of the 19th century, a wave of Christian missionaries aiming to both convert and westernize descended on China, and they did so as footbinding had reached the zenith of its popularity amongst rich and poor alike. According to their 1913 memoir, rather modestly titled How England Saved China, wife and husband missionary tag team, the McGohans, first witnessed the practice being performed on a neighbour's daughter. Seeing bound feet as an obvious focal point for moral critique and reform, in 1875 the pair started up the earliest known anti-footbinding society in the port city of Amoy. The justification was theological. In other words, ladies, you gotta stop destroying God's work. It's giving Lucifer. Sure enough, during the group's first sermon, 9 women pledged to leave their daughters' feet, as God intended, by drawing the cross. As time went on, Reverend McGowan wrote in his memoir, they began to discover that they had helped to perpetuate an evil, and at the close of every meeting, new members were gained to the society. Travel memoirs like the McGohans often used extremely degrading language. The bound foot was uncouth, an unpleasant deformity, hopelessly alien were those hideous goat-like feet men so strangely admire, their walk like the waddling of geese, an utterly miserable sight. Repulsive. From the 1860s onwards, missionary doctors circulated both x-rays and images of the bare foot in medical journals and reports with names like On the Evils of Footbinding. Missionaries then published those pictures in their memoirs, and commercial photographers included them in their collectible photograph books and postcards, which were sold in Western bookstores. Many of these photographs were taken of peasant women who were either paid or otherwise coerced to expose their feet, with promises that they'd only be shown outside of China. But of course, many of those images almost immediately began circulating around the country, and sometimes they were just displayed in the window on the high streets in treaty ports. Now, culturally, this was completely indecent, but soon enough, there was seldom a person in the country that hadn't seen a picture of an unbound foot in one form or another. Many, particularly the elite and educated classes, felt the humiliation in their bones. With one political advisor to China's penultimate emperor writing in his memoir, "Foreigners have long taken photographs of our vices and laughed at us, called us barbaric, and the most laughable matter that brings us the most humiliation is footbinding. Your humble servant is deeply ashamed of it." Fueled by the humiliating rhetoric and obscene pictures that were now circulating around the country, more and more natural foot societies were set up, both religious and secular, Western and Chinese. For a while, many resisted the anti-footbinding sentiment as an imported Western idea, but repetition, as we know, works like a charm. And as the century wore on, following another humiliating loss, this time at the hands of Japan, the tide had turned. With all this foreign meddling, a series of reformist movements aimed at modernising China had begun picking up speed. Footbinding soon became enemy number one, with one reformist thinker writing in an infamous 1896 essay that women were, quote, uneducated beasts, who were too ignorant to even feel shame, adding that not a single one has produced anything of profit. No wonder men keep them as dogs, horses, and slaves. Honestly, by the turn of the century, there was truly no winning for a woman with bound feet. Reform-minded Chinese intellectuals targeted women with bound feet because they felt it made China look like a joke, but anti-foreign rebel groups targeted women with natural feet because they saw it as a sign of, quote, foreign missionary influence. As the turn of the century approached, the Chinese Empire was becoming increasingly destabilized by major rebellions, revolts and uprisings, and by 1911, the Chinese monarchy collapsed. The Qing dynasty, having failed to defend China from foreign humiliation, had lost its mandate, and on the 1st of January 1912, a new republic was officially declared. Now, if you're thinking that everything was just fine and dandy after that, think again. This new republic was an incredibly fragile one, and the reality was that power was fractured across the country. Still, one of the first duties of this new republic was a national ban on footbinding in 1912, because, priorities. Though the ban was never fully implemented because China's first president lasted 3 months. Though, to be fair, by the early 1910s, footbinding had massively fallen out of favour in both those treaty port cities I mentioned earlier and wealthy urban centres thanks to foreign influence. Conservative rural communities who had significantly less contact with outsiders were a different matter entirely. But that would all come to change. You see, after helping overthrow a 2,000-year-old imperial system, China's second president, 𝘀𝗽𝗁𝗁𝗃, a man resembling a sticky-fingered iPad baby who looks visibly bedeviled by every decision he's ever made, had a change of heart and decided to declare himself the emperor in what was, and still very much is, considered possibly one of the most traitorous and short-sighted decisions in all of China's history. On the 22nd of March 1916, baby's playtime was officially over. His little performance lasted 83 days before nearly everyone revolted, and in turn, China entered what we now call its warlord era, where provinces were run like independent states by warlords, and these guys had their own ideas about what progress ought to look like. Once again, their sights were set on the bound foot. One warlord of the northeastern province of Shanxi by the name of Yan Zhishan had such a bee in his bonnet about the practice that he used his powers to not only reinstate the ban, but to set up a small army of foot inspectors, who were often just low-level officials or even local students, to ensure that said ban was carried out. At first, many families simply hid their daughters from inspectors, paid the fines, or just went to jail for a bit. But when Yan realised his plan was failing, he simply granted inspectors permission to enter homes and forcibly remove bandages. To absolutely nobody's surprise, things quickly escalated, and inspectors and anti-footbinding activists in the province began forcibly removing the shoes and bindings off women in public spaces, leaving them unable to get up and walk away unaided. After all, for women that had adopted the Golden Lotus style, their feet simply couldn't support the weight of their body without the bandages and appropriate footwear. Now, Yan realised that women had to want to take off their bandages, so he began encouraging a culture of shame to accelerate his campaign. "Look at you," Yan would say in 1919 at a speech directed to the women of his province. "Don't you have any self-respect?" Soon enough, boys were sent to school wearing banners stating, "I refuse to marry a foot-bound woman," and any secret binders might have an inspector dispatched to their house with a gong, until presumably the family became so irritated or otherwise embarrassed that they just yielded. By the late 1920s, one official operating under Yan's reign of terror began collecting and storing thousands upon thousands of binding cloth strips from his team of foot inspectors, which in turn attracted national attention. Taking advantage of the situation, the official made a press stunt out of it, inviting other officials to a show where he stood on stage, sniffed the bindings and pretended to vomit, which apparently had the audience laughing so hard some of them literally fell off their chairs. Of course, the abuses and complaints that resulted from the campaign were so ferocious that Yan had to issue restraining orders to some inspectors, alongside new rules that ordered all inspections be conducted after sunrise and before sunset. No exceptions. Now look, there were plenty of men who were not happy with their wives and daughters being treated this way, but, and this is a really big but, this was not something men who wished to maintain respectable employment, or employment at all, could realistically speak out against. In Yan's province of Shanxi, all civil servants and village heads were required by law to be anti-footbinding. And in any case, it's interesting to note that men too were undergoing their own bodily humiliations. Their traditional hairstyle, the queue, this shaved head and long plait seen here, was being shaved off left, right and centre. For a good while, the style had represented Chinese masculinity. But now Yan, in line with the rest of the country, declared them detestable and embarrassing, and ordered them to be cut off. Just like the bound foot, they posed no real political threat, but now China had been opened up to the wider world and was being looked at, or rather down upon, they became an eyesore, yet another example of China's humiliation. Didn't they know the world was watching? Asked Yan. That China occupies a part of the world, and Shanxi occupies a small part of China. To be fair, in some cases, for the young and the politically active, the cutting of the queue was a voluntary act of liberation, but in some cases it was done forcibly and publicly by foreign armies and radical reformist mobs looking to make an example out of old boys who wouldn't get with the programme. Anti-footbinding campaigns, many set up in Yan's image, flourished in provinces across China. Though, just like the rhetoric surrounding queue cutting, some took a more pro-liberation stance, such that by 1920, many young girls across China had turned their backs on the practice. However, unlike queue cutting, the act of footbinding was not so easy to undo, especially in older women who were, in any case, markedly more resistant to shaming. In one case, an old lady handed a state inspector a twisted donut and told him that if he could untwist and unfry the dough, then yeah, sure, she'd let her feet out. To her, the women's liberation arguments sounded great in theory, but if this really was about liberation, then why was she about to be left with feet that were harder to walk on and more deformed than the very thing they were trying to prevent? Realising this would literally confine women to the house, many campaigns did eventually make exceptions for older women, though not always. The fact that so many women were resistant to the ban does make the construction of women as victims a rather complicated matter here, and it poses an interesting problem. Many women wanted to bind, so in order to get them to stop, you had to make them not want to do it anymore. And in order to do that, you had to make a pretty convincing argument that undid generations of conditioning, ideally one that didn't take away their ability to walk, while calling them pathetic, wasteful, and lazy. Look, let's not mince words here. The act of footbinding was cruel, but so too were the subsequent anti-footbinding campaigns. Foot inspectors were literally rewarded for making women suffer, even if, just like the queue-cutting mobs, they told themselves it was progress, liberation from the old China. Ultimately, in the context of a wider culture of national shame, the end result was that one person's pride and freedom was predicated on another's humiliation, and in the end, nobody escaped clean. It's often said by the 1920s and 30s that footbinding had fallen completely out of fashion within the cities, and that there were very few women and even less men who would dare publicly voice any kind of defence. But that isn't, technically speaking, quite true. You see, in the port city of Tianjin, the most foreign-dominated corner of China, a small but determined group of gentlemen were working on their magnum opus, Picking Radishes. 2,000 pages anthologized in 5 volumes, devoted entirely to the practice of footbinding. I'm going to be completely honest with you here. Not even the mandate of heaven itself could have prepared me for the dark, breathless ascent into the forbidden frontiers of human nature that is Picking Radishes. Up until that point, I'd never quite read anything like it, and frankly speaking, I hope I never do again. Now, because of the nature of parts of this anthology, the chapter you're about to watch only focuses on the PG parts of this story. And that's because to keep this documentary on this platform, I have to play by a very strict set of rules. So there's going to be a lot of reading between the lines and you'll still get the point, but it's not really the story I wanted to tell you. The story I wanted to tell you is far, far more detailed. And because of this, I've created a longer and completely unfiltered version of the chapter where I employed the help of a man who owes me a favour to use his voice to bring the more colourful parts of the book to life. How'd you find it, Fred?
Oh, how is it? This is without doubt the worst thing I've...
Right. Well, if you're interested in listening to the extended version of this video, you can find it over on Nebula. Nebula's a creator-owned streaming service that's home to some of the most interesting independent storytellers on the internet. Because creators own the platform, it means that we have the creative freedom to make the stuff we really want to make, like this 3-part series I made last year, and of course, the extended cut of this video. Nebula has a huge back catalogue of exclusive content from your favourite creators, from in-depth documentaries to thoughtful video essays, and so much more. And best of all, it's completely ad-free. On top of this, Nebula is one of the best ways to support your favourite creators. And when you sign up using my link, nebula.tv/abstract, you'll not only get access to the extended cut of this video right now, but you'll also get 50% off an annual subscription, which works out to just $2.50 a month, and a significant chunk of that money goes directly to me for as long as you're subscribed. So, if you want to continue to enjoy the blessings of peace, head on over to nebula.tv/abstract and grab your succulent 50% discount today. Sorry. Anyway, back to the story at hand. Where was I? Oh, yeah. Meet my friends, the Lotus Lads. Come on into their world. Make yourself comfortable. Don't make extended eye contact with them. Okay, So picture this. It's the 1930s. You live in one of the most westernized port cities in all of China, Tianjin, and the century of humiliation has hit a fever pitch. The old China, the one you knew and loved with its literati and its great emperors, it feels like she's vanishing before your eyes. Foreign enclaves and council buildings are around every corner. Newspapers are sold in English. Cinemas are playing Hollywood films. You are beholden to foreign regulations and policies dictating everything from the flow of traffic to the usage of the word ye, which the British take to mean barbarian, even though it's not quite what it means. You've already been over this. But anyway, men are wearing suits, women's dress hemlines are rising, and you find yourself mourning. So what do? Well, if you're anything like the 30-year-old port city resident 𝘁𝗍𝗄, you start documenting the ruins. And there's one pile of rubble that you find yourself becoming particularly interested in: footbinding. Beginning in the late 1920s, 𝘁𝗍𝗄 and a few close friends put all of these feelings into words. They decided that the best way to prevent traditions like footbinding from fading into history was to exhaustively document it by curating and publishing an archive of anything and everything footbinding. The backbone of this anthology was a glut of real-life memories of the practice for posterity. Think of it like a limited-run, ostensibly academic journal dedicated to all things footbinding. The name? Picking Radishes. The tone, from a meta-historical perspective, absolutely fascinating. Long story short, the Lotus Lads, the gentlemen behind this magnum opus, managed to produce well over 1 million words on the practice of footbinding in the form of stories, essays, and memoirs. And they are presented by the lads and many scholars who have subsequently interpreted and cited them as real contemporaneous memories of the practice. The anthology is an absolute treasure trove. If you've ever heard any particularly sensationalist claims about footbinding, I can almost guarantee that Picking Radishes is where that claim has come from. Usually via a citation from Wikipedia, which uses as its source a Western-authored pop history book like this, who in turn has sourced its information from an old academic text on the practice like this, who in turn is citing the stories being told by the Lotus Lads on face value and interpreting them very, very literally. The problem is that many of these actors have failed to account for the thing that Yang Shen had tried to warn us all about in his own way all those years ago. And that is, of course, that sometimes people are out here talking bollocks. More modern interpretations of Picking Radishes have quite rightly approached the anthology with far more skepticism. You see, the memories and stories within, which range from overtly sentimental to the kind of writing that makes John Orr look like the second coming of Christ, come from mostly anonymous men who had more likely than not, and very often by their own admission, never even laid eyes on a bound foot. In the port cities, which is where Picking Radishes originates, the practice was very much dead by the 1930s. Case in point, just listen to this foreword from one of the editors. Quote, "We speak about footbinding as if flowers are falling from the sky. In fact, we are doing no better than going to bed hugging a stiff board." Many of the stories told in Picking Radishes read like poorly written works of fiction, because that's what most of it probably is. And they might have gotten away with it had they not decided to start seeking, to quote one editor, confirmation from ancient texts to support the contemporaneous memories they had managed to collect. Ultimately, it's this that gives their game away. Making up fantastical stories is one thing, but faking ancient historical texts to substantiate them is quite another. Now, some of the historical evidence provided in Picking Radishes, like the well-known stories of Pan Fei and Yao Yang, are easy to verify, but some of the other evidence presented, well, not so much. We know that some of the sources presented in Picking Radishes are fabricated because A, there's simply no trace of it that exists before Picking Radishes was published, or B, they sometimes just basically admit it. In the latter case, for example, one editor has to backtrack on himself when called out, eventually admitting that he was in fact the anonymous contributor who submitted a source, a relatively well-known biographical book, to back up one of his many fantastical claims, but that the version of the book he had was a much more detailed version that now neither he nor anyone else can actually locate. Another example is the mysterious case of Fang Xuan, offered up by the Lotus Lads as an example of a Ming Dynasty scholar who shared the Lotus Lads' interests. In his many scholarly essays, which are well cited in the pages of Picking Radishes, Fang enumerates 58 varieties of the lotus foot and establishes a grading system from A1 to C3. And he also describes in detail many supposedly well-known Ming Dynasty drinking games involving lotus shoes. Yet, there's no historical evidence that Fang Xuan or his curiously undated and suspiciously modern prose existed outside of Picking Radishes. As modern historians now note, his voice actually sounds uncannily like that of a certain group of board-hugging gentlemen. And the matter is made infinitely more confusing by the fact that sometimes the Lotus Lads do include real historical figures or snippets of real history in their inventions. A few sources, which are really more in the realm of legends, and they certainly do not go as far back as the song, indicate that sometimes some guys were made to drink out of a cup placed in a woman's shoe as punishment for losing a bet. And then a 20th century Lotus Lad pretending to be a Qing Dynasty scholar by the name of Fang Xuan ran with this, turning the games into various fantastical ceremonies which took place over many hours, sometimes all day, and which sometimes involved dice and scoring cards and using tiny shoes as checkers on board games and taking turns to throw the shoe across the room, and sometimes we just throw the shoes at each other. Oh, don't look at me like that. It's not weird. It's not weird. Everyone did it. Well-respected Qing Dynasty scholar Fang Xuan said it. Not me. I wouldn't do that. I'm just saying if I did, it would be normal and it would have legitimate historical precedence. Okay, so just to emphasise the point here, the Lotus Lads archive isn't fake in the strictest sense of the word. They collected real-life photos, real shoes, real methods for binding feet, but their own personal and often anonymous recollections of the practice, which make up a large part of Picking Radishes, and of course the historical sources used as evidence for certain claims, those are questionable. Very questionable. And most importantly, they are a very long way from being a reliable or representative historical source. In fact, they are only representative of a very specific group of men who existed in a very specific set of historical circumstances. Their works are arguably best read as a collection of nostalgia that reinvented a dying tradition to serve as a sort of psychological fortress against modernization. A curated hallucination of the past, if you will, used by a displaced literary elite to mourn their lost status under the guise of historical preservation. The Lotus Lads were, after all, well-educated men who were looking for vindication to justify their interests. And when they didn't find that vindication in the annals of history, they just made it up. The mysterious Fang Xuan is just one example, but there are many more like it. So many that at one point, I just stopped tracking them. The issue is that many older academic interpretations of this work tend to take what the Lotus Lads have to say on face value. Written in the 1960s, this book by Howard S. Levi is by far the biggest culprit and uses Picking Radishes to draw many of its conclusions in certain chapters. But I don't know if anyone citing this has read this work in full, because if they had, they were almost certainly ignoring the warning lights all over the dashboard. The way Levi writes often makes it completely grammatically ambiguous where the Lotus Lads' feelings end and his own begin. These days, most academics are taking a far more cautious and much more nuanced reading of Picking Radishes. But that more nuanced reading doesn't seem to have quite made its way through the online content machine. I can't even begin to tell you the amount of times I've heard the claims made in Picking Radishes repeated online without even a hint of skepticism. The truth is, with notable exceptions, which there always are, most men were not quite as interested in the bound foot as the Lotus Lads make it seem. In fact, over the centuries, there were as many opinions on footbinding as there were men. But that version of events isn't quite as shocking, and it's also significantly more complicated to try and explain. Now, I'm being a bit cloak and dagger here for obvious reasons, and there's a significantly extended cut over on Nebula and Patreon, but if you want a real-world example of what I'm talking about, go ahead and listen to the episode on footbinding by the podcast Stuff You Should Know. I actually quite like this show, and to be fair, this was one of their earlier episodes, but at around 20 minutes in, they unwittingly become possessed by the spirit of the Lotus Lads and start reeling off insane facts which are taken from the stories told in Picking Radishes, which they'd probably sourced from one of those old academic textbooks which took them literally, which of course leads to Josh and Chuck spending the latter part of the episode giggling at the absurdity of it all, because the stories the Lotus Lads made up were indeed downright absurd. Now, I won't tell you that this episode of Stuff You Should Know and the subsequent rabbit hole it sent me down led to the creation of this video, because I couldn't believe, frankly speaking, that the things Josh and Chuck were saying were real, actual things the literati were openly talking about, because it would be very stupid of me to admit that I spent a large amount of time working on something that was in no way, shape or form going to meet community guidelines, and that because of this, I therefore put myself in a position where I had to put out this incredibly watered down version of this particular chapter, or not release it at all. But I suppose you might say it was a factor. Anyway, at least now you're aware of just how profoundly the Lotus Lads have altered the historical record, even if I can't go into all the colourful details. On the plus side, I'm quite sure that pulling the wool over our eyes was part of the Lotus Lads' game, and I've no doubt that, just like Yang Shen, they would have been kicking their feet and giggling hysterically had they been around to hear it. There are many lessons here, but I think one above all bears repeating. The next time you find yourself asking whether or not somebody would just go into the historical record and tell lies, the answer is, unequivocally, yes. Yes, they would. So, from the beginnings of knowable history to the deep dark depths of the content machine, it has always been. While it's true that by the 1930s, no respectable woman within their right mind would bind their feet, it's also true that it did continue to survive in pockets for many decades. In a very practical sense, the events of and leading up to World War II made the need to run away from marauding soldiers far more important than the fear of shame, or any deference to tradition or fashion. And a final coercive communist campaign in the 1950s dealt the final death blow to the practice. By the mid-1980s, only 500 or so women with bound feet remained. Today, that number may well be in the single digits. Soon enough, it will be zero, and footbinding will exist in memory only. Throughout the 90s and until as late as 2010, some footbound women made a modest living dancing for tourists in China's Yunnan province, living artefacts, some say, of a world that the new China would have much preferred to forget. But the body, of course, doesn't work that way. And for many, there is a profound and deeply unsettling feeling that comes with the comprehension that the ink of this era is barely dry. It's no surprise, really, that the language used to think and talk about footbinding is so often distancing. These are modern times, you'll hear people say. We're not them, they're not us. We know better now than to succumb to such barbarities. Perhaps they're right. After all, progress is linear, is it not? Moving forward in a straight, upward trajectory with improved morality, freedom and rationality as we walk the line to enlightenment. Yet, when you really think about it, the factors that underpinned footbinding are hardly unfamiliar ground. After all, bodily shame, desire and competition do not exclusively belong to dynastic China, or women for that matter. I said at the start that this wasn't just a story about feet, but it was a story about China. That the practice of footbinding would give us a window into its past. But see, windows have a funny way of catching the light. Look at them from the right angle, and they become mirrors. There in the reflection lies a simple truth. The body tells a story. It may not be the story you like, and it may not be the one that reflects your reality, but there it is anyway. How many of us, for one reason or another, have found ourselves desperately wanting to rewrite it? And how many of us have found ourselves punished when we are unable to or refuse? I wonder, are we really more enlightened? Less barbaric? Is our capacity to brutally shame others substantially abated now we're further down the line? Or, like night and day, have our deepest desires and darkest shames simply shifted, rearranged, rebalanced, if you will, into forms that feel a bit more acceptable in our modern times? Have we really moved further along the line? Or are we just going round in circles? This right here is what makes footbinding as a subject so utterly fascinating. At every turn, the bound foot defies black and white thinking. Good guys, bad guys, victims and perpetrators, that kind of language just never seems to quite work when it comes to footbinding. Because while it's true that male emotions and desires set the precedent, it's also true that men did not carry out the binding for the most part. That decision was mostly made by women. But what kind of decision is it really when one's personhood is at stake? When the stakes were your daughter's humanity, her chances at finding protection? In that context, would it have been brave to refuse to bind your daughter's feet or just negligent? Footbinding was cruel and it was painful, I won't argue with you there, but it wasn't a senseless act. In fact, it was a logical response to the world these women found themselves in. And the sad truth is, we may never fully understand that world, because aside from a select number of relatively modern interviews, many of them conducted by Western missionaries, almost everything we know about footbinding is filtered through the gaze of others. The poet kings and their fantasies, the playwrights looking to make a spectacle, the scholars hoping to pull the wool over our eyes to make some wider point, the uncomfortable and often humiliating gaze of Western missionaries, those who saw a new China and longed to rid themselves of a great national shame, the men looking to launder their private fixations through the historical record, the content creators looking to tell you an interesting story. With so many eyes, which are the right ones to look through? The truth, just like free will, is a rather complicated thing. But complexity is usually where the truth actually lives. And who knows? Perhaps one day you'll come across a pair of these tiny shoes hiding away in a display case in a dark corner of a museum. And even though you won't be able to tell who the owner of this pair of shoes was, what she did with her time, who she loved, what she aspired to be, they won't feel quite so unfamiliar. Perhaps, upon reflection, you won't just see vanity or cruelty, but also the millions of real women who, once little girls themselves, with scholarly ambitions and Cinderella dreams, bent by forces so much heavier than their own emotions, once walked a not entirely unfamiliar path, albeit in different shoes.